The representative of Ecuador for the statement. I give the floor now to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for your briefing. Colleagues, this is a decisive moment for the region. As President Biden said earlier this week, and I quote, "All-out war is possible." But colleagues, all-out war is not inevitable. We are all too aware of the strong headwinds. However, there is still an opportunity to have a ceasefire with hostage release in Gaza and a diplomatic resolution of the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. Doing both, alongside efforts to integrate Israel into the region, could reinforce peace and stability. And it could breathe new life into what I think we all recognize has been a lack of progress toward a two-state solution. The decision to embrace that change, to take the difficult steps necessary to achieve a more safe, peaceful, prosperous future for all, lies not in the hands of the Security Council, but in the hands of decision makers in the region. But this council can support progress in the right direction. We can create opportunities for the forces of change to ultimately triumph over the forces of violence and terrorism, division, and despair. That is what President Biden has worked to achieve this past year. This work hasn't been without setbacks, and it certainly hasn't been easy, but he believes, and I believe, that the building blocks are there. First, a 21-day ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel, which would provide space for a diplomatic solution consistent with Resolution 1701 that pulls Hezbollah forces back from the border and allows people to safely return to their homes in both countries. We've been working tirelessly to achieve this outcome and encourage all member states to support the proposal that the United States and other countries put forward earlier this week. Second, the framework for a ceasefire with release of hostages in Gaza is endorsed by this Council in Resolution 2735, which would end the war, allow for a surge of humanitarian assistance, and set the stage for the reunification of Gaza and the West Bank under a revitalized Palestinian Authority. And third, the potential historic normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which would further bind together Israel and the Arab world and help marginalize the terrorist proxies that are funded, armed, and sponsored by Iran, sowing chaos across the region. Achieving these three steps would require political will, but would make Israel more secure. And it would create the conditions for a better future for the Palestinian people, a future in which they enjoy equal dignity and security, freedom and self-determination. Colleagues, in just 10 days, we will mark the one-year anniversary of October 7th. 1 year since Hamas killed 1,200 people, murdering children in front of their parents and parents in front of their children. 1 year since Hamas unleashed sexual violence as a weapon of war. 1 year since Hamas took hundreds more hostage, including Americans and citizens from more than a dozen countries, some of which sit on this council. As President Biden said, the world must not flinch from the horrors of October 7th. Any country would have the right and responsibility to ensure that such an attack could never happen again. Israel is no different. With that, we must all recognize that allowing the terrorist group that committed this carnage to dictate the terms of peace is hardly a recipe for regional stability. And even as we press for a ceasefire and demand that all parties to the conflict protect civilians and humanitarian personnel, we all must not forget that Hamas continues putting civilians at risk every day in Gaza. But its refusal to accept the ceasefire deal on the table, by its continued practice of hiding fighters and commanders in schools and hospitals and tunnels under civilian infrastructure. Now there are members of this council that won't even utter the word Hamas, let alone condemn its brutality on October 7th and after it. But colleagues, acknowledging that reality does not mean ignoring the plight of the Palestinian people. We mourn the tens of thousands dead, nearly 100,000 injured this past year. Nor does it relieve pressure on Israel to protect civilians. Quite the opposite. What's more, while our eyes rightfully turn to the situation in Gaza and Lebanon, we cannot forget that Palestinians living in the West Bank have been subjected to violence from extremist settlers, watching in horror as their homes are set on fire, their olive trees uprooted, their land seized for illegal outposts and settlements. Their suffering, too, matters. Their humanity, too, matters. The current situation is so very clearly unsustainable. And while I wish there was a shortcut to peace, we know that's not the case. Not in the General Assembly, and not here in the Security Council, which has repeatedly underscored that a lasting and comprehensive resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can only be achieved through direct negotiations between the parties, consistent with the principle of land for peace, previous resolutions, and international law. And so the United States will continue to oppose unilateral measures that undermine the prospects of negotiations toward a two-state solution. That includes one-sided resolutions like the one recently adopted by the General Assembly, which do little to bring Palestinians closer to a democratic state of their own. It also includes the advancement of Israel's program of settlements, which we have reiterated over and over again, hinders the prospects of peace, weakens Israel's security, and is inconsistent with international law. And it includes unilateral efforts to undercut the Palestinian Authority, whether by withholding the transfer of tax revenues owed to it under the Oslo Accords, or potentially not sustaining correspondent banking relationships between Israeli and Palestinian banks. We have been clear to Israeli officials that these relationships are necessary for preventing a deepening economic crisis in the West Bank, and that a lapse of these legitimate financial efforts would increase the risk of illicit financing, undercutting Israel's security. Colleagues, we have a shared responsibility to enable diplomacy between the parties. The 21-day ceasefire across the Israel-Lebanon border would allow negotiations toward a diplomatic solution, reducing tensions along the blue line and allowing people to return to their homes in both countries. The ceasefire with hostage release in Gaza, and ultimately a normalization deal with a firm commitment to a political horizon for the Palestinian people. Creating openings for diplomatic process takes political will, and it requires leaders to make some difficult decisions. But for the sake of Israeli, Palestinian, and Lebanese civilians, and all those in the region desperately hoping for peace, it is critical that those leaders make the right decisions. Let us help rather than hinder them in doing just that. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement.